I was the director of sales at Lamborghini Atlanta from 2009 to 2015, and when I talk to people about that, one of the first questions is always, tell me about your worst customers. And I'm not here to air dirty laundry or use names or anything like that, but there were some very entertaining cases that you could really learn something from when you think about shopping for a car. And so I decided to think through my 10 worst experiences and compile them for a video. The first is a guy who ran a Ponzi scheme on himself. Now that sounds ridiculous and probably impossible, but it was a wildly entertaining and terrible financial outcome for him. And I'll explain what happened. He came in with a Maserati, and I always think of Maseratis as sort of like the perfect gateway drug supercars because you can like any aspect of a Maserati and that point you to a better next supercar. So if you like the aesthetic or the sound, you might like a Ferrari. If you like the materials and the luxury, you might like a Bentley. If you like, the extreme nature of a sports car, you might move towards a Lamborghini or a McLaren, something like that. And so, it's always interesting when somebody comes in because you can just listen to their remarks about their Maserati and know what should come next. And it seemed like this guy wanted an Aston Martin, but he was most certainly not a car guy. He didn't know what year his car was through the initial trade figures. He kept telling us it was 2 years newer because he actually didn't know. He told us it was an addition to the car that never existed, that we couldn't find any evidence of. It was a really, really strange thing, but his most important issue was that he refused to lose money on the car. And of course, he'd had the car for several years and they had depreciated massively, as Maseratis do. So I was showing him example after example of cars just like his that were for sale for far less than he was demanding on trade, as though he thought we had some mystical ability to artificially improve the value of his car, which certainly we did not. But he said, look, if you can get me what I need for my trade, I'll buy whatever Aston Martin you want me to. And I'm like, man, that doesn't make any sense. Like, buy the car that you want. He's like, nope, as long as you can put this deal together, we can do business right now. Now, at the time, we had a pretty big incentive on the Aston Martin Rapide. It was probably a $20,000 or $40,000 rebate. We were able to discount them really heavily, which also means that we can pretend to give someone that much more on trade if they're willing to pay the MSRP for the car. And he had some weird requests about trim replacement and stuff like that. But ultimately, I was able to do his deal by selling him a car for so much more than I would have sold it to him if he just wanted the car and didn't have this ridiculous trade requirement. And so I sell him a Rapide. He drives it a lot more than he expects to. And he also has this mental block of putting more than 2,000 miles on the car. And so he brings it right back and says, I'm ready for my next car. And he has the same rule. Now, obviously, I had just sold him a car for about $40,000 or $50,000 more than I really sold him the car on the paperwork that he signed. And so I'm not gonna pay more for it coming back. But as I recall, this would have been around 2012, and we had the Aston Martin Virage. And for a short time, Aston thought that they could have a car between the DB9 and the DBS, and the Virage was right there. It was like a 240 MSRP. They only made them in model year 2012, and they were sale-proof. I'll actually have another Virage story later in this compilation. But this car, I had extra money back, and ridiculously, even though no one should have ever paid MSRP for a Virage, he was very happy to, as long as he was shown the exact same money back for his Rapide. And so he bought this car and got stuck in it forever. I mean, the next week I started to get calls from every dealer in the United States with him trying to sell this car or trade it on something else. And none of them were going to give him what he had just paid, obviously, because that's not what he really just paid. And so he was having no luck. He ultimately, I think, ended up trading it on a Bentley, which could have had an equally massive rebate back. But I mean, ultimately, Ponzi schemes run out because there's no new money to feed them in the normal, scam sense of the word. In this case, he just ran out of cars that were more and more expensive with more and more margin to fake discount by giving him too much money for his trades. So during that time window, Lamborghinis were not necessarily like flying off the shelves, but when the Aventador came out, that changed just a little bit. And so we did have a really long waiting list for the cars because most of the good customers wanted one, and we weren't going to get all that many. We got 1 or 2 a month. I had a long line, but the problem that always comes up when you have a high demand car and new people coming in, as I did because I was a relatively new salesperson at the time, that want the cars, and you start bending the rules, right? You take people out of order. And every single time we did that, it bit us so hard. The first one was our demo for the Aventador, and you sell those cars kind of. You can't usually transfer the title. They're going to drive around on temp tags for a while, but they usually get a car at MSRP or very close to it, and then they just have to wait until they can have their personalized license plate on it. And so this car we had sold, but we hadn't really given them the title or anything like that. And within a week or two, I start to get calls from other dealers saying that this customer is trying to trade his car in or sell it privately, which he's not even really like allowed to do. And I told the guy, I said, look, I'm glad you love the car as you're telling me, but I keep hearing that you're trying to sell it. And his objection was like so turned up to 11 that it was obvious that he was lying. He said, that is a lie from the pits of hell. And I said, look, I believe very much in spiritual warfare. I don't think the netherworld meddles too heavily in exotic car transactions, but all I need to have happen is just people not tell me that my car that I'm supposed to still own is for sale by you, so whatever it takes. We had actually squeezed a guy in to get our very first one, and the problem, again, in that case is that most of the people that are now getting like the hottest car on earth don't actually have experience in owning cars that are immediately more valuable in the arbitrage to the rest of the market at large. And so the same thing happens. We start to get calls all the time. And as a brand, Lamborghini doesn't want to see the first cars out there on the market immediately. They want the dealers more so to control the immediate value of the cars. And so it was just an absolute mess. And it happened all over again with the Roadsters, because you've got these new customers that have bought a lot of cars that want something. And I had this guy who didn't necessarily deserve, based on the number of cars he bought, to buy an early Aventador Roadster. But, he bought a lot of cars from us. He was building a good relationship, and we kind of squeezed him in when we had an extra allocation at some point. At the end of the day, he comes to us with his car ready to be delivered and starts demanding insane over allowances on his trade. He was a financing challenge and it was a big deal. And I was like, look, man, we're just not able to discount these cars by giving you more than your trade's worth. Your trade is worth this. That's what it's got to be. And we kind of reached this impasse where he had agreed, all right, well, I guess I'm just not going to buy the car. And that was fine because I could have sold the car to 10 other people. But then he went behind my back, starts calling the owner of the dealership and the general manager and just crying about Ed won't negotiate with me and give me the deal that I want. And my general manager just bent over backwards and gave him what he wanted. The problem with that was, it wasn't that I didn't want him to have a good deal. I just knew that he had a really, really big mouth. And he would let everyone in my community, probably even larger than that via the internet, know that he had gotten more of a discount than he thought he was going to be able to, because he's such a great negotiator. And that is exactly what happened, which entered this little idea into the world that new Aventadors could be had at discounted prices, when that was most certainly not the case. And it caused this massive sell-off. Everybody got scared that they were going to lose so much money on their cars. And it just created absolute pandemonium in my little microcosm of the Aventador market. That's why it's generally better for people who have more experience to have the cars. Now, one of those was actually unintentional, because I sold a very good friend of mine, Tom, a Huracan way too early. And it wasn't my fault or his privilege. It was very simply that the car got built by Lamborghini before the 5 cars that I had ordered before his. For whatever reason, his arrived. He never bought a new Lamborghini. He was well down the list, but it was fair based on his relationship with the dealership for him to have gotten that car, but he got the first one. And again, the same thing happened. He thought he was going to be able to flip this car for an immediate profit, and he could if he did it right, but he put it on eBay with the worst photographs the very next day. And I called him. I was like, dude, you cannot do this. Like, this is exactly what the manufacturer doesn't want to see happen with the first car that got delivered in the whole state. It was a mess, but we got it dealt with. I ended up bringing it through, wholesaling it out to a dealership that wanted some used Huracan inventory, and we made it all right. In the car business, they say there are 3 people who will always call you back. People who are trading down, have terrible credit, or negative equity. And this is a story about negative equity, the most negative equity that I have ever seen. Now, a lot of times people set up these really long-term loans on exotic cars, and just like a mortgage, you're not paying much principal down for many, many years. If you decide that you want to trade out of a car that's depreciated long beyond your remaining payoff, you're going to have a ton of negative equity, meaning that you owe a lot more than your car is actually worth. And I had a customer who, he's not really a bad customer, so this doesn't necessarily fit, other than the fact that the deal was impossible. And it took me well over a year to make a deal work for this customer, even though he desperately wanted to buy a car. He just didn't have enough money out of pocket to overcome this massive hurdle of his negative equity. And generally, I think he owed $100,000 on a $50,000 car. So 100% more than the car's value in negative equity. And there just aren't that many cars that you can bury that kind of negative equity in that he would have considered owning. And so same thing again, a Virage popped up, which we had a massive rebate. And most banks will loan at least up to MSRP, maybe MSRP plus taxes or 10%. We finally had the right car with the right discount, with the right incentive to make a deal happen. But if you have a guy with negative equity and you're a car salesman, as long as you work hard enough, eventually you can find a way out, but it takes exactly the right car. Now today, the LP670, the Mercy SV, is one of the most high demand and hottest used exotic cars that you could possibly imagine. But when they were new, that was most certainly not the case. And there were massive rebates for a handful of them that were remaining in inventory. There was a Telesto car, a Blue Fontes car, a Monterey Blue car that just sat at the port in Baltimore for forever. And we had all the window stickers we could just call and have it delivered to the dealership whenever we had a customer. And I had a guy, a very young kid from Boston, who wanted to trade a 997 Turbo on the car, and he wanted this Grigio Telesto car. So we got the deal done, got everything set up, and ultimately secured the car, got it down here, and he was going to drive his 997 down from Boston. Now, we didn't have a ton of profit in the car because we were having to discount it so heavily. It was well known that you could get a big discount on one of these cars. And he told us that, the 997 had kind of been his daily driver. It had a lot of miles at the time for like a 2 to 3 year old Porsche Turbo, but I think he said it had 70,000 miles and it needed a little bit of paint work for some curbs and things like that. And he shows up a few days later having road trip down from Boston in this car in the most destroyed but functional Porsche I've ever seen. I mean, it was the patina Porsche for CarTrek 6 paled in comparison to every single panel needed paint work. It was impossibly cheap. We had numbered it pretty cheap, mostly due to the miles, but then it shows up and it was just like, what happened to this car? But again, he was a young guy. He said he'd made his money in technology, which is usually code for his grandfather worked a lot harder than my granddad, and he just was able to do such things with money. But he bought this car and immediately road trips it home by way of several different destinations back to Boston. And I don't even know why I pulled it, but a year or so later I pulled the Carfax, I think just to see how many miles he'd put on it, and he'd already crashed it. In fact, he crashed it on the way home. There was like a parking lot level incident with a police report before he made it all the way back. He's traded it since then. Now somebody owns this as like the pristine SV of their collection, but it had a very, very hard first week of its life. There was another SV that I got as a pre-owned car for a customer, and we financed it using a lease kind of Premier Financial style, and then he would build up equity by having it for a little while and the car slowly going up in value, and he would constantly refinance it. I think I refinanced the car for him 3 or 4 times where he would cash out $20,000, $30,000, in most cases actually having to pay new taxes and stuff like that or build it into the loan. But essentially, anytime I could cash him out, he wanted to do a new loan on this car. And so it probably looks on Carfax like it's got 5 or 6 owners, but he's had it since the second owner, turned it in very quickly. A lot of times customers had wives that were very supportive of their automotive obsessions and their hobbies and their spending and all that, but that was not always the case. And I had a customer whose wife was like a staunch environmentalist. And so he was a wonderful customer, but she made it a big challenge, primarily because he didn't want her to know that he owned any of these cars. And so I sold him a Gallardo, another Gallardo, a Mercy, something else. I mean, just tons of cars that he loved and wanted to drive, but he couldn't. So he kept stashing them in these little public storage units around town, and he was sneaking out at night to go drive these cars, which made her think that he was cheating on her. And he told me the story that one night he was at home and maybe she had a couple extra glasses of wine that night, and she said, "Did you know that all of your car is made of plastic?" And he said, "Well, no, it's not. It's made of aluminum and steel and some carbon fiber." He was actually talking about his Tesla because that's what he daily drove. She was very happy about the Tesla, very environmentally friendly, I suppose, at least she thought so. And she said, "My private detective says you drive very, very recklessly." And he's like, "Wait a minute, what do you mean my car's plastic?" She said, "Well, he had a tracking device and he couldn't make it stick anywhere with its magnets." And he said, "Well, why are you tracking me?" And she said, "Well, you're sneaking out every night to go do something with some girl, and I am tired of it." And I don't know exactly how he explained it away, but I think he ended up convincing her that she was crazy. She probably was to some extent as well, but they're no longer married, but he does still have a lot of great cars and motorcycles. Now, there was a customer that was not a great guy, but he became a very good customer, probably out of the spite in my heart that I should, feel badly about. But here's what happened. He wanted to get into the exotic car rental business, and he came to me because I knew about it, having come out of that business before being at the dealership, and asked me a lot of questions. And we actually found a business that was really struggling, and they were looking for some support. And so we both met with the owner of this business and offered him kind of a way forward, a new business model that would have worked really well and made him a lot of money. Well, this guy, after roping me into that discussion, went behind my back, cut me out of the deal, took equity in this business and a job with them, and there was nothing left for me. And that was okay because I had a great job at the dealership. I was very happy and I didn't really want to. I was going to treat it as a side job. He wanted it as his own job. So whatever, that's fine. Well, immediately then they needed to spin up a lot more cars, and we had already found kind of an investor that was going to come into the picture and help them buy a bunch of cars. And so I sold that guy about 10 cars over the course of the next month or two. It was a wonderful month in sales for me at the dealership. And amazingly, and perhaps most, grace of God, I was looking at buying this amazing trade. So my Scud that I had for a long time was Silverstone over red, and I love that spec on Ferraris. And at that point, I couldn't remotely afford one, but there was a really cheap 2005 F430 that was Titanium, silver over Bordeaux, and it was a spectacular car. Every single option, ceramic brakes, carbon racing seats, all the carbon interior, and it was wonderful. And I was so close to buying it, but I really couldn't stretch to do it. It was not the right time. And so I ended up saying, hey, here's a car that I genuinely love. I would love for you to take it out into the rental market, put a ton of miles on it, bring it back, and then I'll buy it cheap enough that I can actually afford it, because I liked terrible examples of really cool cars even back then. And so he bought that car, as nice as it could possibly be, and it broke constantly. I have never seen a 430 become so unreliable, but it cost him so much money over the course of the next few months, and eventually he just dumped it to get out of it. And so I dodged that bullet, but I guess I probably dodged the bullet of the business because they closed that pretty soon too. One thing that anyone who works at an exotic car dealership in the United States will tell you is that Chinese college students are wonderful clients, and that is generally because their families send them to the United States to get educated, and they have absolutely no idea how much a reasonable car for transportation purposes costs. And so I had a lovely young lady come in, and her father had just given her the amount of money he thought she should use to buy a car, and it was $200,000. And obviously he thought that was going to buy like a small Audi. It ended up being almost enough to buy a Gallardo. In fact, we had an LP 550-2, kind of the continuation of the Balboni, and that car, with some money back, I think it was able to be sold for about $180,000, which with taxes in Georgia was right where it needed to be. She bought that car, paid in cash, and had a whole lot of fun. She had some boyfriend with her that they were just driving around, having a blast, going to school, whatever. Well, about a year later, I got a call from the boyfriend, and he said, Mr. Ed, we have a huge problem. The car was crashed. Oh no, is everybody okay? He said, yes, we're okay. But what happened was somebody flashed a light at them and they'd run off the road. Now it sounded, in the way that he described it, like somebody just took a picture of a Lamborghini and they crashed it. And the car was properly totaled. But he said that the insurance wouldn't pay. And I said, well, your insurance or the at-fault insurance, the person that ran you off the road? He said, well, they didn't stop. I said, okay, well, you've got a couple of options. You could either look through security footage for all the surrounding businesses, see if they provide it, see if you can get a license plate, tell the cops, and maybe they can go find them. But I didn't think there was actually another car, or at least not one that really did anything wrong. And even if you do, they probably got minimum coverage for minimum budgets, $25,000 damage limit, and you're not going to get much out of it. And so really what you need to do is just call your insurance and have them pay for it. He said, well, we had just gone to China for Christmas for the month, and we had emailed our insurance saying to cancel it while we were gone and the car was parked, and we asked that they put it back into place the next month when they got back. Now, the response they'd gotten from the insurance company had been, we can take it off because you're making that request for right now, but we can't make future changes to your policy based on today's email. Just let us know when you're back and we'll reinstate your coverage. Now, they didn't have a lien, so there wasn't any bank that was going to get mad. Obviously, they would have gotten a letter from the registration, but they didn't care. And so they got back. Obviously, they did not contact their insurance company. They went out the first night and crashed the car. Now, Dad didn't need to know that they had crashed this car oceans away, and so they said, Ed, we have to get a car that is better than the Lamborghini for less than you can sell the Lamborghini for. And I'm like, well, the Lamborghini doesn't move. It is broken. And I ended up getting our body shop to buy it kind of as a clean title salvage for, I think, 60 grand. And I'm like, look, but I don't know how much more cash you have. Unless you have another 200 grand, we're not going to come up with a car that looks better than yours. And we had a barely used Aston Martin Vantage S Roadster that certainly doesn't look like a nicer car than a Lamborghini to anybody else, but it was a convertible and it was silver. I don't know. They were able to decide that it was. They scraped together their allowances and got about 20,000 bucks. And so I guess for about $80,000 they bought this Aston, and I don't think Dad ever got mad. They kept driving it, and they kept the insurance on that one. When I had the rental car company, I had a yellow Gallardo, and I'd rented it to this guy. And when I went to the dealership, I tried to, get as many of the rental customers to come over and buy cars. These are people already in my network. And so this guy came in, and we talked about his car. And I knew at the time that he'd rented the car that he had like an immaculate Lotus that he never drove, and he talked about how perfect it was. Very different ownership style than mine, but that's fine. That's the way you love cars. Well, he wanted an Aston Martin Vantage with a manual transmission, and we had an amazing one, like every single option, a high sticker. Probably, not the best investment car, but a really, really cool Aston Martin. We go back and forth. It's a complicated deal, and he's a tough guy to negotiate with, whatever. It takes us hours and hours and hours, and we don't deliver him the car until very late in the evening when it's already dark. And he's test driven the car, looked around the car, everything's great, and he drives it home. And he's a little nervous because he wants to PPF the car and protect it, and he never wants to have any blemishes, and he had like a 40-mile drive to get back to his house. The next morning, he shows up as we are opening, and the car is covered like in this temporary clear bra, almost like saran wrap. And he comes in, and you can tell this dude hadn't slept a wink. He is freaking out, and he has this extremely, I don't know, it must have been 4 or 5 pages of imperfections that he had found shining bright lights on this car overnight. And I start looking through, and other than, maybe an error light that had come on because it was an Aston Martin, almost everything was totally normal for a hand-built British car. We're going through it. I'm looking at the car, and he's, whatever. And we're just like, okay, look, it's an Aston Martin. It's yours. He wants to unwind the deal, give it back, just total buyer's remorse. As we're talking, I'm like, look, man, I understand, you have this car, you drove it home, it's titled, it's in your name, the warranty is started. Like, I understand that it's not what you want. Let's look at something else. And at the time, we had a similar MSRP because of how nice and highly spec'd this manual car was. That was an S, which gave like 10 more horsepower and a slightly better paddle shift transmission as opposed to the regular sports shift transmission. And so I said, let's go drive this car. Maybe you'll like it better, and then we'll look it over very, very carefully and see which one you like better. And this takes all day. I go to lunch with him, and we're just kind of talking back and forth. He's just distraught over owning this imperfect car that was as perfect as I'd ever seen an Aston Martin be. But whatever, we go back and forth for the whole day. He spends the entire day at the dealership, and finally he agrees to the trade. Again, in the dark. And so he drives the thing away, and as you would imagine, the next morning he comes back with the new car and a new handwritten list of all of the flaws in this car. And so I'm looking at him like, yeah, it's like that. We could probably wet sand that out, whatever. It's just, look, hand-built, hand-painted cars are not perfect. It's not a Honda, and it's a lovely car. It was well-built, but it's an Aston Martin, and they just have little things, whatever. And so he's just out of his mind. And so I don't know how we'd even done it. I think we collateral swapped the loan since it had just been open for like 24 hours, but whatever. And so, of course, my response is, well, look, let's go look at this car. And at that moment, my boss came over and he said, Ed, do not sell this guy any more cars. Let's just deal with the 2 cars that he has, and we'll go on. Ultimately, the outcome was you own this car. You drove it home. You bought it. You signed the paperwork. We bent over backwards to give you more money than we should have on your trade to make this deal work, because it's now going to be a 2-titled car for whatever. And so enjoy it. We hope that you grow to love it. And whenever you bring it back, we promise it's going to be better than we expect it to be, and we'll give you the same money as any other perfect car, and you'll love it. Well, that didn't happen, of course. I found out like 2 weeks later he traded it for a Maserati, which couldn't possibly have been any better, but I hope he had a wonderful time. In that same vein of buyer's remorse, immediately, I had a guy, older Italian gentleman, super nice guy, and he just loved Italian cars, always wanted one. He'd had some Mercedes and BMWs and things like that, but he came in and he wanted a Maserati. And we had a Grand Sport, so not a really reliable or useful car, always broken, but we had run it through the shop. It was a car on consignment that we probably shouldn't have even taken, but it was a really nice Grand Sport. He wants this car. We go dealing with it, and he test drives it, loves it, understands it, has been looking forward to Maserati ownership for a very long time, and he buys this car. And so we've test driven it, and I'd parked it kind of around to put the temp tag on, make sure his seats adjust the way he wants it to, and send him on his way. And I guess he had forgotten something at my desk or something like that, because ultimately he kind of pulled around the dealership after taking delivery, signing all the paperwork, it's his car, and parks it right in front of the building and then walks in another door. And I'm like, oh, hey, what's going on? He says whatever it was, which I have totally forgotten about, because at that very moment, the car was crashing itself into a Jaguar in front of our dealership with no one driving it. Now, there was a very, very slight grade, and he had left the car running and put it into neutral and forgotten to engage the parking brake. And so the car rolled backwards on its own and not going very fast, but enough to damage the paint of both cars, hit the Jaguar. And he goes bananas. His brand new Maserati was damaged. He's like, your car just hit your other car. Well, one of them already has your name on the paperwork, and you drove it there and you left it there, and it was really your fault that this happened. But I'll tell you what, you pay to fix yours. We'll pay the blot guy to repaint the front bumper of ours. Everything will be okay. And he was just, oh no, he's just pacing around, talking to everybody, trying to get somebody to say something different. But look, man, it's your car. You took delivery, you crashed it, and it's okay. We're not mad. Just go on about your day. And if you need a recommendation for a body shop, we have several. Well, he took it home, but a couple of days later, a more elderly Italian woman came in, and she had these rhinestone glasses and more makeup than I thought you could paint on a face, and she asked to speak to the general manager. And that was one of the days I was very pleased not to be the general manager. And she wandered right into his office, and she just yelling at him, letting him have it. Then it shifts to kind of trying to sweet talk him and maybe offer him some other forms of negotiation. But she was like, you need to take my son's Maserati back because it's your fault that he crashed it into one of your cars. And he was like, well, we're not going to do that, man, but I appreciate you coming in. And they spent well over an hour talking. And he came back and he's like, that was his mom. I said, I figured that part out. But it was still his Maserati, and I'm sure Mama was proud. But without a doubt, the worst customer encounter that I ever had and lived to tell the tale, which I never thought was going to happen in the moment, was a guy in a Gallardo Performante. So we had this car. It was kind of an aging piece of inventory. We'd acquired it for the wrong reasons, whatever. It was a 2012 Gallardo Performante, an LP570 Spider. So this guy comes in, and he had been in many, many times and spinning all these ridiculous tales about his tech fortune and his professional tennis player wife. We wouldn't tell us who it was, but she said he was going to buy this car one day, but not that day. But he just wanted to look around. And so I was busy one day after I talked to him several times. And so he starts talking to another one of the sales guys, and he refuses to let this guy test drive a brand new Lamborghini on a Saturday, which was generally the policy. Like, you don't need to be out test driving these cars. And it gets heated. And he's screaming profanity in our showroom on a Saturday into this salesman's face. And this salesman kept a lot of firearms on his person, in his desk, around him. So this customer was in real danger if this situation escalated, and it was on the verge of significant escalation. And so the management staff actually stepped in, and they were like, look, what's going on? He's like, I want to test drive that car right now. And they're like, well, I'll tell you what, we'll let Ed test drive it with you. And I'm like, guys, come on. And so, we have to move a bunch of cars out of the showroom to get this thing out. But they're like, maybe he'll buy it. I'm like, he's not going to buy it. We've talked to this guy for hours. It's just like time-wasting guy, has nothing better to do on a Saturday. Whatever. But I've been told to take this guy on a test drive, so we're going to do it. Now, our test drive route is sort of dictated by the insurance to be very easy to do. So no unaided left turns, traffic lights, things like that. And so it's designed to be very, very controlled. So we go out of the dealership and go get on the highway, go and exit south, switch seats, they drive back. So we're supposed to demonstrate how the car works, show them the features, and then let them drive. And that section of the highway, honestly, is very rarely patrolled by police. It's supposed to even be state troopers that do it there, but there are some local cops very occasionally. Regardless, I let him have the car and make sure he's comfortable, everything's adjusted, and this dude takes off like he is a wannabe getaway driver, Jason Statham transporter. It's unreal. And I'm like, dude, nope, we got to slow down. I appreciate that you want to experience the car, but that's just not how it's going to go. And he would. And then we go crazy again. And I'm like, man, what are you doing? Like, sir, just slow down. It's okay. You can experience the car at a little over the speed limit, but he was trying to go 130, 40 miles an hour. And he'd slow down and then just go crazy again. And about a quarter mile up, there was a local cop driving in the same direction. And I'm like, look, there's a cop. This is great. It's going to calm the situation down. He downshifts, lunges up at the cop, and barely gets slowed down before he rear ends the police officer in a bright yellow Lamborghini convertible. And I'm like, look, man, we just cannot drive like that. I've got to tell you to slow down. If you continue to drive like this, I need you to pull over and I'll get us back to the store. And if you want to buy the car, that's okay. He then goes, watch this. No. And he downshifts again and goes around the cop so close that I thought they were going to hit mirrors. And of course, the top is down on this car. And I look at the cop and I'm like, what are you doing? Arrest this guy. And I'm like, and the cop, no reaction. I guess he assumed that we were just messing with him, because we knew the cops well in the area, but he won't chase him. I'm like, I'm going to die because we're coming up on a clover leaf. And he looks at me and he goes, I am invincible. And I go, well, I'm not, and we're about to flip this car over. And holy cow, I mean, thank goodness it's a wonderful all-wheel drive car and it was very, very stable and we made this turn. But we get back to the store and I'm like, I take the key out as soon as the car stopped and I'm like, sir, that is not how we drive it. And of course, like, oh yeah, I didn't really like it anyway. And he just like storms off, gets in his car and leaves. And I walk in there and they're like, so did he buy it? I said, no, he did not buy it. And if you ever make me do that again, it'll be my last day here. Successful car purchasing is all about knowing your buying power and being able to move quickly. And the best way to do that is getting pre-qualified with Premier Financial Services. Call one of these numbers, speak to one of their representatives, fill out their application, and then you'll know exactly how much car you can buy. You'll approach a seller, tell them you're already qualified, you've got your simple lease set up from Premier Financial, and you'll be able to close very, very quickly. That's why Premier is one of the most powerful partners in the world of exotic car financing, and that's why I turn to them every time I go out and try to buy something crazy.